In the February of 1925, in the Talpa village of northeastern Romania, an 11-year-old girl named Eleonora Zugun set out to visit her grandmother, who lived in the neighbouring village, some 2.5 hours away by foot. Such a long walk for a young girl is undoubtedly dangerous, but for Eleonora, it proved to be dangerous in a way many would not expect. On her journey, Eleonora supposedly found a silver coin laying on the roadside, and while finding money may seem innocent or even perceived as a divine sign by many, Romanian folklore teaches otherwise. For, according to traditional folk beliefs and superstitions, objects on the roadside or at crossroads may very well be magically contaminated, discarded by witches after spell work, or intentionally placed there to pass a curse onto whoever happens upon them. When it comes to coins in particular, it is believed that they could contain a familiar spirit that once belonged to a witch who desired to be rid of them, thus throwing them away so as to pass them on to someone else in seemingly inconspicuous places. But such superstitions meant little to an impoverished 11-year-old child with a sweet tooth, even if for Eleonora the silver coin that seemed to have fallen from the sky would be the catalyst for poltergeist phenomena that would torment her and terrify those around her for the next 2 years, and eventually cause her to be known and remembered as the Devil's Girl. My name is Laura, and you are watching The Paranormal Scholar. Before we dive too deeply into this case, I'd like to take a quick moment to thank Bright Cellars for once again kindly sponsoring today's video. As we tumble into autumn, I am reminded of all of my favourite things about this time of year. The changing of the leaves and the darkening of the nights, Halloween, thick woolen jumpers, and, of course, cozy evenings spent at home with the fire on and a delightful bottle of fragrant, light-bodied white wine, perfectly tailored to my taste and delivered straight to my door. Bright Cellars is a monthly wine box that matches your palate to a curated selection of high-quality wines from around the world. By taking their quick 7-question quiz, the world of wine becomes more approachable, with your individual taste preferences being matched to a series of wines specifically chosen not merely for their quality, but also their exclusivity, with Bright Cellars sourcing premium wines from small hidden gem vineyards from locations including Italy, Spain, and Portugal. Bright Cellars boxes, as well as being highly personalized, are also highly convenient. Sustainably packaged and delivered straight to your door, there is no need to shop around at the grocery store and risk wasting money on wine you might not enjoy. Best of all, however, I love their focus on education. Each Guaranteed to Delight box is accompanied by wine education cards, which outline each bottle's tasting notes, suggested pairings, best serving temperatures, and origins. Bright Cellars now even offers members exclusive wine wisdom lessons, bite-sized sessions that enable you to taste your way to discovering new wines to enjoy, all of which makes connecting with others over wine all the more fruitful and memorable. And so, if you are interested in indulging in an autumnal evening at home with good company, good conversation, and above all good wine, you might like to consider a Bright Cellars subscription. Currently, Bright Cellars are very generously giving my viewers a limited time offer of 50% off your first 6-bottle box. Simply click my exclusive discount link in the description to get started and help support my channel in the process. Thank you. Now on with the video. Upon arriving in her grandmother's village, little Eleonora spent the money she found on the roadside on sweets, which she ate all by herself. Her cousin, who was also visiting her grandmother at the time, became very upset that Eleonora did not share the sweets with her, and so the two girls began quarrelling. Hearing the heated argument, their grandmother, who was 105 years old and reputedly a witch, intervened and told Eleonora that the sweets had been bought with money left by the devil, and that by eating them she had swallowed the devil too, thus she would never more be free of him. The very next day, poltergeist phenomena began, targeting and surrounding Eleonora, with some locals even suggesting that it was her own grandmother who had cursed her. At first, it was small things, objects in Eleonora's proximity, moving or flying, and stones being hurtled against the house from the outside, breaking windows. Unable to forget the roadside coin, Eleonora's grandmother became convinced that her granddaughter was demonically possessed, a belief which became very popular among the locals. As such, Eleonora was quickly sent back to her village, where just 3 days later, the paranormal phenomena broke out again. Supposedly, the phenomena at her home consisted of strange apparitions and disembodied wails of unknown origin. When Eleonora would enter a room, all metal objects began moving and heavy pots would start to levitate. When she would walk around the village, the waters of the river crossing the location would start to boil, and hailstone rain would then descend upon her house. Sensational and dramatic occurrences that seemed to defy explanation. Understandably, panic soon overtook the small village of Talpa. Several locals supposedly attempted to help Eleonora's father manage the situation and guided him to find help within the Orthodox Church. Eleonora's mother had died years prior, and he had become overwhelmed by the circumstance. On one occasion, Eleonora was taken to the holy relics of Saint John the New of Suceava, one of the most venerated saints in eastern Romania. Many miracles are associated with his relics, and so Eleonora's father and neighbours believed that they could also work wonders on her. But it was to no avail, with some reports claiming, chillingly, that the efforts only doubled the diabolical manifestations. Determined to find a way to help his daughter, Eleonora's father decided to take her to a priest in a nearby village, assisted in his endeavour by several neighbours and the schoolmaster in the village. After praying over Eleonora for 2 days and having witnessed a series of objects moving on their own, it became clear to the priest and those present that the phenomena surrounding Eleonora were the result of an unseen force. Thus, Eleonora was taken to the Monastery of Corove, where she spent 3 weeks being observed by the clergy and preparing for exorcism. Incredibly, the abbot of the monastery wrote a letter to one of the doctors involved in the case later, in which he claimed that he and several clergymen and priests witnessed over 400 paranormal phenomena, most of which were floating objects around Eleonora. He also described that on Wednesday during the Passion Week of that year, at 8 o'clock in the evening, a wooden spoon from the monastery kitchen, some 50 meters away from Eleonora's location, travelled all the way to hit Eleonora in the head as a priest was praying over her. That same night, as she slept, Eleonora was violently thrown out of her bed twice and hit by objects in her proximity, such as nails from the walls, sugar cubes, a candlestick, and a bottle. The abbot even went on to describe to the doctor how he picked up every object himself and took them to his chamber next door. Once the objects were removed, the attacks on Eleonora ceased, only for the abbot to become their new recipient. A pair of boots, a coffee grinder, a matchbox, clothes from the hanger, and a 20-kilogram sack of flour were all thrown into the door of his chamber. Then the light in his hands was extinguished, and a pillow flew at his head. At the same time, Eleonora is said to have claimed that the force was hitting her, as if with fists in her chest. The abbot stated that the ordeal lasted from 8 o'clock that evening during the prayer session and ended at 11:45. The next morning he found 3 nails under the sheets of the bed in which he had slept. Whatever the cause of these happenings, the force responsible appeared to possess a remarkable ability to move objects. Not merely were the items about the monastery relocated, thrown, and manifested by unseen hands, they were moved seemingly with precision and purpose. After all, later that day, 4 people standing in the kitchen with Eleonora are said to have witnessed a pot full of tea rising up from the oven up to 1 meter in the air and thrown on the floor, all without spilling a single drop of the liquid. Then that night at dinner, a pot of hot soup flew from the oven, this time spilling the contents on the feet of the 8 people present, with Eleonora, as if by design, being the one who was burnt by the hot soup the worst. A little while later, sugar flew into the lamp and then rained over the table. A glass of wine shattered, and on the veranda, a coffee cup and its dish shattered as well. The rather chaotic dinner ended with a box of lit matches flying through the open doors of the guest room and the kitchen into the grocery cellar, burning everything without fire or wind. Without a doubt in the minds of those present, there were diabolical forces at work. Further proof of this seemed to be provided sometime in the following days, when Eleonora was hit in the back by a mysterious coin. Upon fetching and cleaning it, the abbot noticed that the coin was 108 years old. He gave it to Eleonora, who buried it in the ground and put a brick on top of it. Finishing her little ritual, she turned to leave. However, after just a few steps, the coin hit her in the back again. Shocked, the abbot and Eleonora removed the brick and dug under it to find that the coin had indeed vanished and seemed to have been the very same old coin that struck Eleonora for a second time. The abbot, mystified, put the coin in his pocket to see if the phenomenon would repeat itself. Half an hour later, when the abbot decided to touch the coin in his pocket and verify that it was still there, he found that it had vanished, its new location unknown. Upon reading the varied and sensational phenomena recorded in the abbot's letter, the doctor sent his skeptical secretary to the monastery, hoping for an easy conclusion to the case. And yet, when they arrived, they, like the abbot before them, recorded a series of inexplicable occurrences. In particular, the secretary was supposedly most unnerved when the cork of a wine bottle that Eleonora had been holding sprung on its own, sprinkling wine into his face and causing him to want to leave immediately. His driver, however, was overtaken by dizziness for about 10 minutes thereafter. When he came to his senses, he supposedly attempted for half an hour to turn the vehicle around, with the car being pushed by an unseen force back to its initial position each and every time. For all of this, however, the most terrifying phenomena happened during one of the exorcism sessions on Eleonora. According to the accounts of those present, a lightning bolt manifested out of nowhere, shattered the stained glass window of the church and hit the priest leading the exorcism right in the face. Struck as he was, the priest had to be immediately transported to the hospital, for he was in a moribund state. And so, after 3 weeks, the clergyman at the monastery concluded that the exorcisms had to stop, not only because of the potential dangers, but also because a diabolical contagion seemed to have spread among the clergy, who believed that Eleonora was soon to be fully possessed by an inferior devil of sorts, and not necessarily a demon in the traditional Christian sense. Their fears were supposedly enforced by the press, as Eleonora's case became the subject of news, with superstition and skepticism coming head to head and giving way to much controversy. As such, Eleonora was committed to an insane asylum, where the paranormal phenomena continued, with it being freely acknowledged by the medical professionals there. In an attempt to keep both her and the other patients safe, they kept Eleonora isolated. Although locked in her chamber and constantly supervised, on the 2nd of May, Eleonora vanished from her room, with the staff at the asylum later commenting on the incident, "We don't know what Eleonora Zugun had become." In many ways, the happenings were out of control. And so the phenomena experienced by Eleonora was witnessed by many, and spread, controversial, incredible, unbelievable through the press until her story reached Fritz Grunewald, an engineer and parapsychologist from Germany who was particularly interested in the physical phenomena of mediumship and the problems of instrumentally recording them. His interest piqued, Grunewald set out for Romania, enlisting the help of Kubi Klein, a journalist from the area who had written sympathetically about Eleonora. The men contrived to have her removed from the asylum and returned to the monastery of Goreve, so as to observe the paranormal phenomena at leisure. Thus, between the 9th and the 18th of May, Grunewald is said to have recorded no less than 187 paranormal happenings at the monastery, with his shorthand notes today being revered as the fullest minute-by-minute record of poltergeist phenomena prior to the invention of the tape recorder. According to Grunewald's notes, the main locations of the poltergeist activity were the monastery kitchen and the guest house in which he and Eleonora were accommodated. He also noted that the most common type of phenomena around Eleonora was moving objects, ranging from the slow tilting of a large pot on the oven to quite violent hurlings of moderate-sized objects at or near people. There were also apports, occasional raps, and on one or two occasions, the mysterious conflagration of matches. And sometimes a foreshadowing of things to come, Eleonora seemingly being struck by invisible hands. The phenomenon that Grunewald deemed the most valuable in his nearly 2-week investigation was recorded on the 15th of May. As he sat opposite Eleonora at the table, a small coin fell onto it. Eleonora had her hands on the table as he saw the coin fall from a height of about 20 centimeters. He sat upright, with his gaze deliberately fixed on Eleonora so that he observed closely. Supposedly, Eleonora shrank a little when the coin fell. As for Grunewald, he believed it was quite impossible for her to have thrown it onto the table, since she had both of her hands placed on it in plain sight. He continued to sit opposite her and watched closely for the next half an hour or so, when something came from Eleonora's back, about 80 centimeters above the table and 20 centimeters above her head. The object went away towards her left side and fell to the floor. He noticed that it was a silver necklace with a blue stone, a gift that Eleonora had received from Klein, but which she gave in turn to the cook at the monastery. And so Grunewald concluded that the object could have only come from the kitchen, as the cook was there at that time. About this incident, Grunewald stressed that it was particularly valuable, as he saw the necklace float over Eleonora's head in steady motion while she was sitting still at the table. It was, he could only conclude, inexplicable. Undoubtedly, Grunewald was left affected and fascinated by the numerous phenomena that he observed. And so, when he returned to Germany, he made arrangements for Eleonora to live under his supervision in Berlin. Sadly, he passed away only a month later, a heart attack having claimed him at only 41 years old. His plans had not gone forward, and Eleonora was left in the hands of her family until the September of that year, when Countess Zoe Wassiliko von Serecki, an acquaintance of Klein, took her under her protection. The Countess, an Austrian of Romanian origin who was raised and lived in Vienna, was a renowned parapsychologist and astrologer of her time. When she visited Eleonora for the first time, she said that she found her dirty, wretchedly clothed, and thoroughly frightened. The Countess observed and documented the paranormal phenomena until January 1926, when she was able to bring Eleonora to live with her in Vienna. It is reported that the young girl adjusted quickly to her new surroundings and was pleased with her new and more civilized life. Now living together, the Countess was able to learn more about Eleonora, and not just the phenomena that followed her. She deemed her a bright and intelligent child that was, in some ways, emotionally backward, for she delighted in toys designed for children much younger than she was, perhaps because such things had not often come her way in her own impoverished childhood. During her time with the Countess, Eleonora was also examined by a nerve specialist who deemed her healthy and in no way abnormal, save for an unusual sensitivity of the skin. The Countess also compelled Eleonora to participate in mediumistic sittings and seances, which she arranged. But, by all accounts, Eleonora was allowed to live a more or less ordinary life, with her attending classes to become a hairdresser. All the while, the Countess continued to document what she believed was poltergeist activity. According to her notes, object movements and apports were common and often occurred in good light, even outdoors in the noontide sunshine. She witnessed objects falling out of thin air and landing with loud noises, sometimes after having ostensibly come through closed doors or out of locked cupboards. On one occasion, the Countess made a note of an incident that seemed curious even to her and unlike everything that had been reported before, describing a shadow which glided down slowly in front of the window and not straight but in a zigzag line in one of the rooms. Thereafter, she supposedly heard a low sound of something falling. When she looked, she realized that a dominoes box made of iron had fallen to the floor, and while the box was still locked, some of the dominoes that had been inside of it were now laying next to it on the floor. Similarly, when Klein visited the two in Vienna, he noticed Eleonora standing with a cat in her arms at the bookcase, as a dark grey shadow came from behind her, passing along her right side and falling under the table upon the cushion at his feet. When he looked, it was a tin box that had stood before on the washstand on the other side of the room. On more rare occasions, the Countess claimed to have heard disembodied and breathy, toneless voices in Eleonora's presence, but any effort she made to communicate with them failed. Considering the shadow and believing it to be the force that was tormenting Eleonora, the Countess helped her to develop an ability for automatic writing, so as to channel messages from it. Yet, based on the writings, the intellect of the supposed entity seemed to correspond precisely with that of the child herself, and not, as had been anticipated, of some higher, darker, malevolent force. And yet, as time went by, it was difficult for those exposed to the happenings to conclude anything other than malevolent involvement. After all, whilst under the supervision of the Countess, the entity that was fairly spiteful to Eleonora until then evolved to become alarmingly violent. In the full-scale poltergeist assault that followed, Eleonora's fingers were supposedly pricked as if by needles. She would be roughly scratched on the face, neck, arms and chest, leaving painful wheals on her hypersensitive skin. She was also supposedly sharply bitten on her hands and arms, with the bite marks sometimes being damp. The Countess was certain that these events she had witnessed herself occurred under conditions in which fraud would have been impossible. Something unseen was tormenting Eleonora, and seemed to have no intention of stopping. On the 30th of April, the phenomena around Eleonora were witnessed for the first time by Harry Price, the prominent British psychical researcher and friend of Grunewald. Although Price himself has been the subject of controversy, following allegations of dishonesty based on debatable evidence in the unrelated and infamous haunting of Borley Rectory, his observations in the case of Eleonora Zugun deserve attention. After all, Price had seen Eleonora on 3 occasions at the apartment she lived in with the Countess in Vienna. There he is said to have observed object movements and the appearance of scratch and bite marks, becoming convinced that some of the telekinetic phenomena witnessed were not the work of normal forces. He claimed to have seen, in one instance, a cushion move off a chair when both the cushion and Eleonora were in his line of vision. Even so, he was less certain regarding the scratches and bite marks. Interested to study them further, he invited Eleonora and the Countess to his National Laboratory of Psychical Research in London. There, he was able to observe Eleonora for 2 weeks, a time in which she was mostly allowed to play with toys and amuse herself, while Price, members of the laboratory, and certain members of the press documented the phenomena. According to reports, the object movements and apports diminished, with some even stating that there had been 1 or 2 possible attempts at cheating by Eleonora. Nonetheless, Price and the Laboratory Council concluded that under scientific test conditions, movements of small objects without physical contact undoubtedly took place. In some cases, objects were even apported from fairly distant rooms in which Eleonora had never set foot. The bite and scratch marks, however, continued to be frequent, with the more striking ones being reported on the afternoon of the 5th of October, under the supervision of 2 members of the laboratory, a representative of the Daily News, and 2 other witnesses. According to one account, Eleonora was tying up a box when she gave a gasp and moved her right hand towards her left as distinct teeth marks appeared on her wrist. Then scores-like scratches appeared on her right forearm, cheeks, and forehead. Shortly after, a series of marks like some form of letters appeared on her left forearm, all rising to distinct inflammatory swellings within 3 or 4 minutes, fading slowly. They also claimed that Eleonora was under close observation and could not have produced them by herself by any normal means. Curiously, after Eleonora's return to the continent, the telekinetic and apport phenomena dwindled away, while the bite and scratch marks evolved, gaining the addition of copious quantities of highly offensive spittle. These phenomena were investigated from November 1926 to January 1927 by a committee established in Berlin, consisting of a zoologist and 4 medical professionals. Under their strict examination conditions and in bright light, they witnessed the phenomena manifesting on Eleonora's hands, as each of her hands were held by a controller on either side of her. The spittle that frequently appeared on her was also examined, and it was found not to be the secretion of her skin, nor saliva fresh from her mouth, for the latter was relatively free of microorganisms, while the substance found on her skin swarmed with the bacteria Staphylococci. They also witnessed Eleonora attempting to help the phenomena, which they deemed to stem not from systematic and malign deceitfulness, but from childish bad manners and prima donna-ish vanity. Eleonora and the Countess continued to go on tour throughout Germany for the following month, in which notable paranormal investigators observed the phenomena. Not everyone who observed Eleonora was so convinced of the paranormal activity. One of the investigators, Dr. Hans Rosenbusch, later publicly stated that not only he detected Eleonora in fraud, but he had also detected the Countess in helping her. Thus, a new layer of controversy was added to the case, with the Countess responding to the allegations in great detail, citing her own notes from the investigation. Although she instituted legal proceedings against him for his allegations, they were later dismissed for technical reasons. Even so, her colleagues, who had observed the phenomena for many months, supported the Countess, signing a statement to confirm that they had observed the phenomena in bright light under stringent conditions, without observing anything to incriminate the Countess. Sadly, there seemed to have been no consensus or resolution between the two, with several parapsychologists and investigators taking sides and attacking each other's competencies. And so, before too long, the war between rival researchers forced itself into the centre of Eleonora's story, with not much being known about what Eleonora herself was experiencing in the background. And yet, with the passage of time and the cooling of emotions, the conclusion seems rather obvious. Almost everyone agreed that, in recent months and at that time, Eleonora had been attempting to assist the phenomena. Instead of blaming her and leveraging her attempts to invalidate the evidence collected thus far, a wiser route would have been to understand that her life for the previous 2 years had been not only shaken by an unseen force that hadn't been disproved, but also dictated by superstitious locals, medical professionals, and paranormal investigators, each with their own agenda and good intentions. Certainly, at the time of the controversy, Eleonora was only 14 years old. Her coming of age was anything but normal. To some, both now and at the time, it is all too easy to forget that when dealing with the paranormal and those affected by it, we are all still human beings. In this way, Eleonora was more than a victim of whatever forces tormented her. The cultural shock she must have experienced, transitioning from her impoverished life in the villages of interwar Romania to the glamour of the European occult revival in the 1920s and the civilized provisions of the West, undoubtedly had a significant impact on Eleonora's demeanour, and even instinct to sustain something that, although had brought her much pain, also brought her opportunities that she wouldn't have otherwise been able to access. Whatever suffering the bites and attacks brought, they also brought her comfort and care. Ultimately, however, Eleonora soon lost her powers, whatever they may have been, with the onset of the menses in the early summer of 1927. She also lost much of the attention that had been on her until then, and so she returned to Romania. In 2015, her surviving nephew told the press that his aunt Eleonora never offered to speak of what happened to her in her childhood, and that it was very difficult to get her to say anything about the case. From 1927 until her death in 1996, she supposedly lived a normal life and did not report any more paranormal activity. She married twice, never had children, and had her own businesses as a hairdresser and later a seamstress. Her family described her as good at heart, saying that they enjoyed her company and that there was nothing evil about her. The seeming loss of power and cessation of paranormal phenomena in 1927 left the parapsychologists involved in her case feeling validated in their shared belief that the phenomena were the result of a poltergeist emerging from her subconscious. Self-punishment, induced fear of the devil, and inappropriate needs, desires, and guilt that faded as she came of age. And yet, there were incidents that make such a conclusion seem hasty and overly convenient. The sources on this case have reported on events that, although not sufficiently explored at the time or in the time since, correspond with the presence and dissatisfaction of a familiar spirit, as is described in Romanian folklore. An idea that had been dismissed from the very beginning by researchers. Eleonora herself supposedly suggested as much when she explained to those who investigated her that she would save food to feed the entity that she referred to as the devil, either to satisfy its appetite or provoke it with bad foods. Elemental in nature and of immeasurable force, familiar spirits are believed to be loyal if treated well, and possessive if neglected. And when observed, they seem to act out in spite, energized by those who misunderstand them. Much like a cat, a form that such spirits are often associated with. If struck the wrong way, it will bite and scratch the hand that feeds it. Such a theory brings us right back to the beginning, and the silver coin which an 11-year-old Eleonora found lying on the roadside. Cast off, perhaps, by another who was desirous to rid themselves of the familiar spirit which tormented them. Whether Eleonora Zugun was a victim of such a capricious familiar or her own subconscious, we may never know. For now we may only learn a single harsh truth from her story, that we are all but sailors in the unknown, and that we ought to be reserved in our denials of that which we do not fully understand. Thank you so much for watching. I truly hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe for more of the paranormal. Equally, you may like to sign up to my email newsletter over on paranormalscholar.com to receive notifications of all new videos direct to your email inbox. And if you cannot wait until my next video, why not watch the one suggested on screen now? Until next time,